No one noticed when George Miller's hands trembled as he signed the paperwork at the scrapyard. The engine was dead. The windshield cracked. The seats torn, but it was the last thing his wife had touched. George only needed enough money to buy one train ticket, to get his daughter Emily out of town before the debt collectors seized their home. Just as the tow chain wrapped around the bumper, a black limousine pulled up. Vivian Carter stepped out, examined the chassis number, and said 5 words that changed everything. "I'll buy it, $1 million. But 12 hours earlier, George Miller had been a different man. Not broken yet. Not desperate enough to sell the memory of his dead wife for the price of a train ticket. George was 39 years old, though his face carried the weight of 50. Lines creased the corners of his eyes from squinting at engine parts under fluorescent lights for 20 years. His hands were perpetually stained with motor oil, the kind that doesn't wash out no matter how hard you scrub. He lived in a rental house on the eastern edge of town, the kind of neighborhood where eviction notices appeared more often than birthday cards. He was a mechanic by trade, or had been. Before the blacklist, before the accident, before everything fell apart. There had been a time when George Miller's name meant something in automotive circles. He'd designed a fuel efficiency modification that had caught the attention of major manufacturers. Then they'd made him sign papers that turned his innovations into their property. Then they'd pushed him out. Then they'd made sure no one else would hire him. His daughter Emily was 8 years old. Small for her age, but sharp as a tack. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and a way of watching the world that made her seem older than her years. She'd learned not to ask for things they couldn't afford. She'd learned to pretend she didn't hear the arguments through thin walls when bill collectors called. She also had a medical condition that required specialized treatment in the city, 200 miles away. It had started as fatigue, then progressed to episodes where her heart would race for no reason. The appointment was scheduled for 48 hours from now, if they missed it. The doctor had said in that careful way doctors have when delivering bad news. The window for effective intervention would close. George understood deadlines. The eviction notice taped to his front door gave him 72 hours. The medical appointment gave him 48. The choice was simple and impossible: save the house or save his daughter. He chose Emily. He always chose Emily. Vivian Carter, at 42, had built an empire on precision and ruthlessness. She ran a technology conglomerate that specialized in automotive innovation, the kind of company that appeared in business magazines with headlines about disruption and vision. What those magazines didn't mention was that Vivian had spent the last 6 months hunting for a single piece of evidence, a prototype vehicle that contained proof of corporate espionage, stolen patents, and possibly manslaughter. That vehicle was sitting in George Miller's driveway, its engine cold and dead, its true value hidden beneath layers of rust and broken dreams. Vivian had her reasons for being in that scrapyard. None of them involved charity. The supporting cast assembled around them like pieces on a chessboard. Ronnie Bledsoe owned the scrapyard. A man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose handshake felt like touching something unwashed. Clinton Marsh worked for the debt collection agency. The kind of man who used legal paperwork the way other people used brass knuckle. Corbin Hayes was a fixer for a rival corporation, specializing in making evidence disappear and witnesses forget. Then there were the others, Ingrid Chen, Vivian's attorney, who trusted no one and believed in nothing except verifiable facts. Dr. Serafina Wallace, the pediatric specialist who would either save Emily's life or watch the opportunity slip away. Bonnie Martinez, a journalist who had been tracking corporate malfeasance for 3 years and was one story away from either a Pulitzer or a lawsuit. All of them were about to collide in a scrapyard on a cold Tuesday morning. George had tried everything. He'd worked as a day labourer, hauling boxes at the warehouse for $12 an hour. He'd done electrical repairs under the table for neighbours who paid in cash and sympathy. He'd driven for a delivery service until his car finally gave up, sputtering to death in the middle of a residential street. The bank wouldn't help. George had called them twice, sitting at his kitchen table with Emily doing homework in the next room, keeping his voice steady as he explained his situation. The woman on the phone had been polite and inflexible. No payment extension, no hardship program, no mercy. Clinton Marsh had delivered the final notice himself, standing on George's porch with a leather folder and an expression of professional detachment. He laid out the foreclosure timeline like a doctor discussing a terminal diagnosis. 72 hours. Then the locks would change. Then the belongings would go to storage, which George couldn't afford. Then the debt would follow him, growing interest like a tumour. George had closed the door without a word. That night, he sat alone in the garage, his hand resting on the steering wheel of the car he'd sworn never to sell. It was a modified sedan, nothing special to look at, but every inch of it carried memory. His wife Sarah had been the last person to drive it before the accident. She'd been on her way to deliver documents evidence. George had suspected, though she'd never confirmed it when her brakes had failed on a mountain road. The police had called it mechanical failure. George had called it murder, but no one had listened. They'd looked at him with the kind of pity reserved for grieving widows who see conspiracies in coincidence. Now, 3 years later, George sat in that same car and made a decision. Emily needed treatment. Emily needed a future. Emily needed a father who would do whatever it took. He would sell the car. He would buy one train ticket. He would leave this town and never look back. The scrapyard opened at 7 in the morning. George arrived at 6:45. Emily silent in the passenger seat. The sky was the colour of old concrete, heavy with the promise of rain. The air smelled of rust and decay, that particular scent of things being reduced to their component parts, stripped of history and purpose. Ronnie Bledsoe was already there, leaning against his office trailer with a coffee cup in one hand and a cigarette in the other. He was a man whose entire business model depended on other people's desperation. He knew the look of someone who had run out of options. He could smell it the way sharks smell blood in water. George explained what he needed. Ronnie walked around the car slowly, making a show of examining it. He knocked on the hood like he was knocking on a coffin, the sound hollow and final. He peered through the cracked windshield, running his finger along the spiderweb of fractures. He kicked the flat tire with theatrical disgust, then spat on the ground next to it. The performance was deliberate. Ronnie knew that desperation made people accept less. The longer he drew it out, the more obvious George's need became. The lower the final offer could be, it was a kind of cruelty that wore the mask of business. "This thing," Ronnie said, his voice thick with contempt. "You're lucky I don't charge you to haul it away." George kept his voice level. "I just need enough for a train ticket. One ticket, that's all." Ronnie's smile was a slash across his face. "Single dad. Huh. Nobody cares about that here. This is business. And business says your junk is worth scrap metal prices. Take it or leave it." George took it. He had no choice. Emily stood a few feet away, her small hand touching the car door handle. George saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer or a goodbye. When the tow truck's chain wrapped around the bumper, Emily turned away. George did the same. Neither of them saw the man standing in the shadows by the fence, taking photographs of the chassis number with the professional camera. Corbin Hayes had been following this car for 3 months. He lowered the camera and pulled out his phone, dialing a number he had on speed dial. When the voice answered, Corbin said just 3 words. "It's here. Now." Then he hung up and waited. The limousine appeared like a dark ship cutting through fog. It was a vehicle that didn't belong in this part of town. Gleaming black and immaculate against the rust and oil stains of the scrapyard. When it stopped, the rear door opened and Vivian Carter emerged. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than George's annual rent. Her hair was pulled back in a style that suggested efficiency rather than fashion. She moved with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're worth and refusing to accept less. Everything about her spoke of power exercised without apology. But Vivian didn't look at George first. She looked at the car. She walked past Ronnie without acknowledgement, as if he were furniture. She walked past the tow truck driver who had stopped mid-motion, his hands still on the winch controls. She walked past Emily, who stared with wide eyes at this woman who seemed to have stepped out of a different world entirely. Vivian approached the vehicle and crouched beside the driver's side door, her expensive suit touching the oil-stained concrete without hesitation. Her fingers traced a specific section of the frame, just above the wheel well, where a series of numbers and letters had been stamped during manufacturing. This wasn't casual examination. This was the precise movement of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it. She pulled out a phone, photographed the code, sent it somewhere, waited for a response. When her phone buzzed with confirmation, her entire posture changed subtly. She'd found what she came for. She read the code twice, then she stood, brushed off her hands, and turned to face the assembled crowd. The transformation was complete. She was no longer a woman examining a car. She was a CEO about to acquire an asset. "Who owns this vehicle?" she asked. George stepped forward, still wearing his work jacket stained with motor oil from a job 3 months ago. "I do." Vivian studied him with the same intensity she'd given the car. "Did you modify the engine yourself?" "Yes." "Who was the last person to drive it before it broke down?" George's throat tightened. My wife, 3 years ago. Why are you selling it now? I need a train ticket. Vivian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. She looked at Emily, then back at George. You don't know what you're selling, do you? It's a broken car, George said. That's all I know. Vivian turned to Ronnie, who had transformed from predator to sycophant the moment the limousine arrived. Stop the process. I'm making a purchase. Ronnie laughed, a sound like oil over gravel. Lady, with all due respect, this heap isn't worth... Vivian held up one hand, her security detail. 2 men built like fire hydrants in expensive suits stepped forward from the limousine. Ronnie's laughter died. I'll pay $1 million, Vivian said. Her voice was flat, factual, the way someone might state the weather or read numbers from a spreadsheet. Wire transfer, verified within the hour. The vehicle will be transported to my facility, sealed, and examined by my technical team. No one touches it except authorized personnel. The scrapyard went silent. Even the distant sound of the crusher seemed to pause. George felt the world tilt sideways, as if gravity had briefly malfunctioned. $1 million. The number was so large it became abstract, meaningless. It was the kind of number you saw in movies or read in news articles about people whose lives were nothing like yours. Ronnie Bledsoe's face went through a rapid series of calculations. He'd offered George maybe $300 for scrap metal. This woman was offering $1 million. The mathematics of that gap was making his brain short-circuit. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. This is a joke, George said, his voice hoarse. This has to be a joke. I don't joke about business, Mr. Miller. Vivian pulled out her phone, typed rapidly, and showed him a screen. It was a wire transfer confirmation form, waiting only for his bank routing number and signature. I'm not buying this out of pity. I'm buying it because it's the final piece of a puzzle I've been solving for 6 months. George looked at Emily, who looked back at him with that combination of hope and fear that only children can truly master. He looked at the car, the last physical connection to Sarah. He looked at Vivian Carter, who stood like a statue of corporate power in the middle of a junkyard. What puzzle? He asked. Vivian's answer was precise. 3 years ago, a prototype automotive system was stolen from my company's research division. That system was installed in exactly 3 vehicles for field testing. 2 were recovered and destroyed. The 3rd disappeared. This is the 3rd vehicle, Mr. Miller. And more importantly, it contains a black box data recorder that will prove who stole it, who sabotaged it, and who's responsible for at least 1 death. George felt his legs weaken. My wife. Possibly, Vivian said. That's what the data will tell us. Across the scrapyard, partially hidden behind a stack of crushed cars, Corbin Hayes was already on his phone. Carter's here. She's buying the vehicle. We need to move tonight. The voice on the other end asked a question. I don't care how, Corbin said. Steal it, burn it, I don't care. It cannot leave this city with that data intact. Vivian's offer sat on the table like a live grenade. $1 million. More money than George had seen in his entire life. More money than his father had made in a career. More money than he'd ever imagined touching, let alone owning. Enough to pay off the debt, save the house, get Emily's treatment, and still have a future. Maybe even enough to open that small repair shop he'd always dreamed about. Before the blacklist, before Sarah's death, before the world had taught him that dreams were luxuries for other people. But it came with strings. It always came with strings. "If I take this money," George said slowly, choosing each word like stepping stones across a dangerous river. What happens next? Ingrid Chen, who had emerged from the limousine with a briefcase that probably cost more than George's monthly rent, spoke for the first time. Her voice was precise, legal, the kind of voice that anticipated questions and eliminated ambiguity. "The vehicle is impounded under corporate investigation. You sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding proprietary technology. You make yourself available for testimony if legal proceedings require it. You do not speak to the press without authorization from our legal team. Standard protocol for evidence acquisition." "And if I say no?" George asked. Though he already knew the answer, he just needed to hear it spoken aloud. Vivian answered that one. Her eyes met his directly, and for the first time, he saw something beneath the CEO mask. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was recognition of what this decision meant. "Then I leave. Your car gets scrapped. You buy your train ticket. Emily gets her appointment if you can afford it. And whoever killed your wife gets away with it forever. The evidence gets destroyed. The truth stays buried. Justice becomes impossible." Emily tugged on George's sleeve. Her voice was small but clear. "Daddy, are you scared because of Mum?" George knelt down to her level. "Yeah, baby, I am." "What would Mum want you to do?" George closed his eyes. Sarah had been brave. Sarah had been trying to do the right thing when she died. Sarah would have wanted the truth. "I need conditions," George said, standing. "Emily gets her medical appointment, no delays, no exceptions. The money goes into an account in my name, legally clean, and when this goes public, I get to tell my side. I get to talk about Sarah." Vivian nodded once. "Agreed." "One more thing," George said. "I need to know what's on that black box. I need to understand what you're really after." "That's fair," Vivian said. "The black box will show unauthorized code modifications, remote access logs, and brake system tampering timestamps. It will show that someone hacked into your wife's vehicle and caused that accident. And it will show exactly who had the access codes to do it." George signed the paperwork with a pen that cost more than his weekly grocery budget. That night, George and Emily went home to a house that was no longer being foreclosed on. The debt had been paid in full by an anonymous corporate entity. The eviction notice had been removed from the door. George sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone, where a bank balance showed numbers he'd never imagined. Emily was asleep upstairs, her breathing steady and peaceful for the first time in weeks. Someone knocked on the door. George looked at the clock. 10:30 at night. He hadn't ordered anything, hadn't invited anyone. He approached the door carefully, looking through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, someone George didn't recognize, behind him. A dark sedan idled at the curb. George didn't open the door. Instead, he called out. "Who is it? Friend of a friend," the man said. "Just wanted to have a conversation about your recent windfall." George's hand moved to his phone, ready to call 911. "Not interested," he said through the door. "That's unfortunate," the man said, "because my employer is very interested in that car you just sold, interested enough to make you a better offer. It's already sold. Everything's negotiable, Mr. Miller, especially when your daughter's safety is at stake." George's blood turned to ice. He gripped the phone tighter. "If you come near my daughter, You'll what?" The man's voice was calm, almost friendly. "You'll call the police and tell them that someone offered to buy something from you that's not a crime." The man walked back to the sedan. Before getting in, he turned and added, "Think about it. My employer can be very generous, or very inconvenient." The sedan drove away. George locked every door and window in the house. Then he called the number Vivian had given him. She answered on the second ring. "What's wrong?" George explained. Vivian listened without interrupting. "They'll try again," she said when he finished. "Corbin Hayes is persistent, but he's also stupid. He just revealed his hand. What do I do?" "Tomorrow morning. You and Emily are going to the train station, not to run, to catch a train to the city for Emily's appointment. My security team will be there, Corbin will be there too, and we're going to catch him in the act. You're using us as bait." "I'm using his desperation against him," Vivian corrected. "There's a difference. You'll be safe. I promise you that." George didn't sleep that night. The train station at 8 in the morning was crowded with commuters and travellers. Business people in suits clutched coffee cups and phones. Students with oversized backpacks navigated through the crowd. The sounds were overwhelming announcements echoing off tile walls. Wheels on luggage clattering across floors. Voices layering over voices. George held Emily's hand tightly as they navigated through the crowd. She carried a small backpack with a book and her stuffed rabbit, the one she'd had since she was 3. She didn't complain about the early morning or the crowded station. He could see Vivian's security team positioned at strategic points, one by the ticket counter, one near the platform entrance, one by the coffee stand. He couldn't see Corbin Hayes, but he knew the man was there. They were halfway to platform 7 when it happened. Emily stumbled, and George bent down to help her retie her shoe. In that split second of distraction, someone grabbed Emily's other arm. The touch was firm, purposeful. Not the casual bump of a crowded station, but the deliberate grip of someone with a specific intention. George's training kicked in, not military training, but the instinct of a father protecting his child. He didn't think. He reacted with the pure animal urgency of a parent whose child is threatened. He yanked Emily back hard, pulling her off balance but away from the stranger. At the same time, he shouted, "Someone's trying to take my daughter." The station's security guards turned. Vivian's team moved, and Bonnie Martinez, the journalist who'd been following the story, raised her camera and started recording. Corbin Hayes, because it was him. Dressed in civilian clothes but unmistakable, up close froze. For just a second. He considered running. Then he saw the cameras, the guards, the crowd of witnesses. He raised his hands slowly. "Misunderstanding," he said. "I thought she was lost." "You thought wrong," George said, pulling Emily close. One of Vivian's security team stepped forward with his phone out. "Station security. I've got a man here attempting child abduction. Platform 7. Send officers." Corbyn's expression shifted from calculation to panic. "You can't prove anything." "I can prove you're harassing my client," came Ingrid's voice. She appeared from the crowd with a police officer already in tow. "And I can prove you're currently under investigation for corporate espionage. And thanks to Ms. Martinez here, I can prove you just attempted to interfere with a witness." Bonnie kept recording. "Care to comment, Mr. Hayes? Want to explain why you're grabbing children at train stations?" Corbyn said nothing. He knew when he'd lost. The police took him into custody. George and Emily boarded the train with a security escort as the train pulled out of the station. George watched the platform recede into the distance. "Are we safe now?" Emily asked. "Getting there, baby," George said. "Getting there." But the real revelation was still waiting at Vivian's forensic laboratory, where technicians had finally cracked open the sealed black box in George's old car. The black box itself was unremarkable to look at a metal container about the size of a hardback book, encased in impact-resistant housing, but the data inside was explosive. The technicians had needed 3 days to extract and verify it, working with the kind of care archaeologists use when excavating fragile artifacts. Every byte was documented, every timestamp verified, every code sequence cross-referenced. The data was damning. It showed everything Vivian had suspected and worse. 3 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday evening in October, someone had remotely accessed Sarah Miller's vehicle control system. The logs showed the exact timestamp 6:47 in the evening. Sarah had been driving on Highway 12, heading toward a meeting where she planned to deliver documents to a journalist. The hack had been sophisticated but not invisible. Whoever did it had disabled the brake response system first, replacing normal function with null commands. Then they had locked the steering column through the electronic control unit. The throttle had been overridden, set to accelerate regardless of pedal input. They'd turned a car into a murder weapon and made it look like mechanical failure. The crash investigation had concluded driver error compounded by equipment malfunction. No one had looked deeper because no one had reason to suspect. Mechanical failures happened. Accidents were tragedies, not crimes. But the black box remembered everything. The digital signature on the hack traced back to Clinton Marsh's company server. The authorization codes matched patterns used by Corbyn Hayes. The motive was clear. Sarah had discovered evidence of patent theft. Evidence that would have destroyed a $100 million corporate merger. She'd been silenced. The car had been left to rust. George had been blacklisted from the industry to ensure he never looked too closely at the wreckage. It was murder disguised as negligence. Wrapped in bureaucracy, sealed with threats. Vivian called a press conference. She didn't tell George first. He found out when Bonnie Martinez showed up at the hospital where Emily was receiving treatment. Asking for an interview, Emily was in her room, sleeping off the sedation from her procedure. The doctors said it had gone well. If they had waited even another week, the damage might have been permanent. George had spent the last hour sitting beside her bed, watching her chest rise and fall. When Bonnie arrived, George almost didn't let her in, but she showed him her phone, where Vivian's press conference was already making headlines. Major networks were picking it up. "You could have warned me," George said to Vivian when she arrived 20 minutes later. "I could have," Vivian agreed, "but you needed plausible deniability. If I'd told you first, they'd claim collaboration. This way, you're the grieving husband who just found out the truth, which happens to be accurate." The press conference had been brutal and efficient. Vivian presented the technical evidence data logs, access codes, timestamp correlations. Ingrid presented the legal documentation. Bonnie presented her recorded footage of Corbin at the train station. And George, standing at the podium with Emily beside him, presented something none of the others could: the human cost. "My wife died because she tried to do the right thing," George said into the microphone. "And I almost lost my daughter because I didn't know what I was selling in a scrapyard. But now we know. Now everyone knows." The questions came fast and aggressive. George answered them all. When someone asked what he planned to do with the money, he said, "Pay for my daughter's treatment, fix up my house, maybe open a small repair shop, live a quiet life." "Don't you want revenge?" George looked at the reporter who'd asked. "I want justice, there's a difference. Revenge is what they did to Sarah. Justice is what happens next." Clinton Marsh was arrested 3 days later. Corbin Hayes cut a deal and testified against the executives who'd ordered the hit. The merger collapsed. 3 corporations faced federal investigations, and a stolen prototype design was returned to its rightful patents. Vivian didn't walk away clean. The investigation revealed she'd ignored early warnings about the patent theft because she'd been focused on quarterly earnings. She could have prevented Sarah's death if she'd acted sooner. She admitted that at a shareholder meeting. She apologized publicly. She established a fund for whistleblowers and their families. She restructured her company's ethics division with independent oversight. It wasn't redemption, but it was responsibility. 6 weeks after selling his car, George stood in the garage of his newly renovated house. The renovation had been modest, fixing the roof that leaked, replacing windows that didn't close properly, updating electrical systems that were one storm away from catching fire. The kind of repairs that made a house feel like a home instead of a temporary shelter from which you'd eventually be evicted. Emily was upstairs, healthy and energetic, doing homework and complaining about fractions with the kind of ordinary frustration that felt like a gift after months of medical crises. The doctors were optimistic, better than optimistic. They used words like full recovery and normal childhood and no long-term complications. Emily would need follow-up appointments, regular monitoring. But the emergency was over. The crisis had passed. George was building something new, not a car, but a small workshop bench where he could teach Emily basic mechanical skills when she was ready. How to use tools safely, how to understand what makes engines work, how to fix things instead of throwing them away. Sarah would have liked that. Sarah had believed in understanding how things worked, in not accepting easy answers, in looking beneath surfaces to find truth. The old car, the one that had started everything, wasn't scrapped after all. Vivian had it restored, not to working condition, but to museum quality. Professional restorers had cleaned every surface, stabilized every component, preserved it exactly as it had been on the morning George sold it. It was now displayed at her company's headquarters in a climate-controlled glass case with a plaque that read, "Sold for a train ticket, bought back for the truth." The plaque included a second paragraph, smaller text that explained the full story. Sarah Miller's name, the investigation, the conviction of the people responsible, the reforms that followed. It wasn't just a memorial, it was a promise that the company would never again choose profit over people. George had visited once, during the dedication ceremony. He'd stood in front of it for a long time, Emily's hand in his. While cameras flashed and reporters asked questions, he'd answered so many times they'd become a kind of script. "Does it make you sad, Daddy?" Emily had asked when the ceremony ended and the crowds thinned, and it was just the two of them standing in front of the glass case. A little, George had admitted, because he'd promised himself he would never lie to her about important things. But mostly it makes me proud. Your mum did something brave. She tried to stop people from doing wrong things, and we finished what she started. We made sure the truth came out. That matters. Now, in his own garage, George heard a car pull up. He looked out to see Vivian's limousine. She stepped out, carrying a folder. "Mr. Miller," she said formally. "Ms. Carter," he replied with equal formality. Then they both smiled, and the formality dropped. "What brings you here?" George asked. Vivian held up the folder. "Joe Boffer, my new ethics division needs a technical consultant, someone who understands what it means to do the right thing when it costs everything, someone who knows how to spot corporate malfeasance from the inside." George took the folder but didn't open it. "I'm not looking to be a corporate whistleblower." "I'm not asking you to be," Vivian said. "I'm asking you to help me build a system where people like Sarah don't have to be martyrs, where doing the right thing doesn't cost you your life or your livelihood." George considered this. "I'd need to keep my shop, keep working with my hands. Consultation work, 20 hours a month. You set the schedule. And Emily comes first, always." "Always," Vivian agreed. George opened the folder. The salary was generous but not excessive. The terms were clear. The mission was simple. Make sure the company never again chose profit over people. "I'll think about it," George said. "Fair enough." Vivian turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth. Mr. Miller, I'm sorry. I should have listened 3 years ago. I should have investigated. I should have protected your wife." "You didn't know her," George said quietly. "No," Vivian said. "But I knew the warning signs, and I ignored them. That's on me." She drove away. George stood in his garage, holding a job offer that would let him honor Sarah's memory by preventing other families from suffering the same loss. He thought about the broken car in the scrapyard, about the train ticket he'd almost bought, about the choice to sell memory for survival. In the end, that choice had saved more than his daughter's life. It had exposed a conspiracy. It had brought justice. It had turned scrap metal into something precious, the truth. George went inside, where Emily was setting the table for dinner. She'd cooked pasta, mostly successfully, with only minor smoke damage to the kitchen. "Dad," she said, "when I grow up, I want to be like Mum." George hugged her tightly. "Then you're already halfway there." Outside, the sun was setting over a neighborhood that no longer felt like a trap. The house was paid for. The debts were settled. The future was uncertain but possible. And in a museum across town, a broken car sat under carefully calibrated lights, its chassis number visible, its story preserved. A reminder that sometimes the things we think are worthless carry the weight of everything that matters. Sometimes you sell a car for a train ticket. Sometimes a billionaire sees what others miss. And sometimes justice costs exactly $1 million and a father's courage to remember.